On a Tuesday night in Tel Aviv at precisely 9:47 p.m. local time, 7 of Israel's most senior security officials convened inside the Kiryat military compound, the fortified nerve center of the Israeli defense establishment, without the prime minister present. No prior announcement, no official readout, no Benjamin Netanyahu. The meeting lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. By midnight, Israeli media had obtained partial confirmation of the gathering. By morning, 3 senior correspondents from different outlets, Haaretz, Channel 12, and Ynet, had each published independent accounts describing the same thing. A war cabinet session conducted in deliberate secrecy, with Netanyahu excluded, and with one item on the agenda that no spokesperson would confirm publicly. That item, according to sources with direct knowledge of the proceedings, was a decision, not a discussion. A decision about what comes next in Gaza and potentially Lebanon. When a democracy's most senior security officials hold a 4-hour meeting without informing the head of government, you are not watching routine procedure. You are watching a system under extraordinary pressure begin to fracture along fault lines that have been building for months. What those fault lines are, why they matter now, and what this meeting likely decided, that is what this analysis will walk through piece by piece. Let's be clear about what actually happened, stripped of the noise. Israel's War Cabinet, formerly known as the Ministerial Committee on National Security, expanded since October 7, 2023 to include additional senior defense figures, is not supposed to convene without the Prime Minister's knowledge. The cabinet exists precisely to coordinate political and military decision-making at the highest level. Its entire function is to keep the Prime Minister in the loop. The fact that it met without Netanyahu is not a bureaucratic anomaly. It is a political signal. In Israeli governance culture, where informal power networks are as important as formal institutional ones, a meeting of this composition, at this hour, without the head of government, sends one message with absolute clarity. There are decisions being made that the current political leadership either cannot make, will not make, or is being deliberately excluded from making. The immediate consequence of this meeting leaking to the press was a political firestorm inside Israel that began before most of the country had finished its morning coffee. Netanyahu's office issued a statement describing the convening as irregular and calling for a full explanation from the defense establishment. The phrase used in the original Hebrew statement, bilti takin, meaning irregular or improper, was not diplomatic language. It was accusatory. Within 6 hours, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak had given 2 television interviews suggesting the meeting represented a constitutional inflection point. A sitting Knesset member from the opposition used the word coup on live television, then walked it back to structural insubordination. Neither phrase was particularly calming. To understand why this moment carries the weight it does, you need to understand the architecture of Israeli civil-military relations, which is, by design, deliberately complicated. Israel has no formal separation between the military and the political, in the way that, say, the United States institutionalizes through the National Security Council. The IDF Chief of Staff reports directly to the Defense Minister, who is a political appointee. The Shin Bet on internal security that reports to the Prime Minister. Mossad reports to the Prime Minister, but military operational planning, which involves the IDF's General Staff, exists in a space where professional military judgment and political authorization regularly collide. What makes October 7th, 2023, a structural watershed, not just a security failure, is that it exposed the degree to which the political layer had been degrading the intelligence and military layer for years. The subsequent inquiry processes, the public testimony from senior IDF figures, and the internal review reports have collectively documented a pattern. Political leadership prioritizing narrative management over operational readiness, and institutional military leadership losing confidence in the political echelon's ability to make clear, strategically coherent decisions under pressure. 18 months into the Gaza war, that confidence gap has not closed. It has widened. What the War Cabinet meeting without Netanyahu represents, in strategic terms, is the military and security establishment testing the outer boundary of their operational autonomy. They are not staging a coup. They are doing something subtler and, in some ways, more consequential. They are demonstrating that they can act, plan, and decide without waiting for political authorization that may not arrive in a useful time frame. The structural mechanics of how this meeting was organized matter because they tell you something about the level of coordination involved. For a meeting of this composition to occur, reportedly including the IDF Chief of Staff, the head of military intelligence, the Shin Bet director, the National Security Advisor, and at least 2 senior ministers from outside Netanyahu's immediate political orbit. Without the Prime Minister's knowledge requires a specific set of conditions to be true simultaneously. First, the participants must have agreed, in advance, not to route the meeting through the Prime Minister's office scheduling apparatus, which would normally generate a notification. That means the convening was deliberately structured to avoid the standard paper trail. Second, the meeting had to occur at a secure facility. The Kuria is the only location in Israel where all relevant secure communications infrastructure is simultaneously available to this group, which means the absence of a PMO notification was a choice, not an oversight. The Kuria does not host 4-hour multi-agency security sessions accidentally. Third, the fact that it leaked to 3 separate media outlets within approximately 12 hours suggests that the leak itself was controlled. In Israeli security culture, when something leaks simultaneously to competing outlets at that speed, it is rarely an accident. Someone wanted this known. So the question of who benefits from the public knowing this meeting happened is analytically significant, and we will return to it. What this operational picture describes is not a chaotic breakdown. It is a structured, coordinated signal. The participants knew it would leak. They convened anyway. That tells you they wanted the message delivered. The immediate institutional consequences are already visible in the financial and diplomatic signaling that followed the meeting's disclosure. Israel's benchmark TA35 stock index declined 1.4% in the 2 trading sessions following the reports, with financial sector equities leading the drop. International investors who track Israeli political risk as a component of broader Middle East exposure models flag the news as a Tier 2 political risk event. Not a crisis, but an indicator of elevated institutional instability. More significant was the response from Israel's principal external partners. The United States State Department issued a statement through a spokesperson describing the reports as a matter of internal Israeli governance, which is diplomatic language for, we are watching, we are not intervening, and we are waiting to understand the implications. The EU's foreign affairs representative made no public statement within the first 24 hours, which in European diplomatic culture is itself a form of communication. The ceasefire negotiations currently ongoing, involving Qatar, Egypt, and American intermediaries, entered what mediators described to Reuters as a holding pattern. When the political structure of one of the primary parties to a negotiation becomes visibly uncertain, the other parties have every rational incentive to pause. You do not finalize an agreement with a counterpart whose domestic authority to implement it is in question. The economic cost of that pause is not trivial. Every week of continued conflict in Gaza carries an estimated direct cost to the Israeli economy of between $400 and $600 million, according to Bank of Israel modeling published in late 2024. A pause in negotiations, measured in weeks, translates directly into that range of ongoing economic attrition. The systemic implications extend well beyond Israel's domestic politics. The Gaza war, now in its 18th month, has created a set of interlocking dependencies that make any significant Israeli decision, particularly regarding military operations in Rafah, the northern Gaza reconstruction timeline, or potential action against Hezbollah's remaining infrastructure in southern Lebanon, immediately consequential for a web of regional actors. Jordan, which shares a long border with the West Bank, and has been managing significant internal pressure from its Palestinian majority population, has been watching Israeli civil-military dynamics with particular attention. A perception of Israeli strategic incoherence weakens the deterrent value of Israeli military capability in Jordanian strategic calculations. Not because Jordan seeks conflict, but because the dynamics of Israeli domestic instability affect Palestinian authority credibility in the West Bank, which directly affects Jordan's eastern border stability. Egypt's calculation is similar but more acute. Egyptian intelligence services have been the primary ground-level intermediaries in Gaza ceasefire negotiations, a role that carries both influence and liability. If Israeli decision-making authority becomes unclear, if it is genuinely uncertain whether military decisions are being made by the Prime Minister, the defense establishment, or some combination that excludes formal political authorization, Egypt's ability to guarantee implementation of any agreement on the Israeli side becomes correspondingly uncertain. That uncertainty has direct costs for Egyptian diplomatic positioning. The Abraham Accords normalization architecture, which several Gulf states had been cautiously extending toward a potential Saudi-Israeli framework, has now entered a period of recalibration. Saudi officials, according to multiple diplomatic sources, had privately communicated that progress on normalization was contingent on visible Israeli political coherence. A war cabinet meeting without the prime minister is not visible political coherence. It is the opposite. The historical record contains instructive parallels. None of them perfectly analogous, but all of them useful for calibrating the significance of what is happening. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan convened a series of operational discussions with the IDF General Staff that effectively bypassed Prime Minister Golda Meir's direct involvement during the most critical 72-hour window of the war. The decisions made in those meetings, including the authorization of a nuclear alert that was intended to be observed by American reconnaissance satellites, were not formally cleared through the cabinet. They were implemented by the defense establishment, then presented to the political layer as operational facts. The aftermath of that episode contributed directly to the institutional reforms that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of parallel decision-making. The Agranat Commission, which investigated the failures of the Yom Kippur War, specifically recommended strengthening the formal authority of the Prime Minister over security decision-making. Those recommendations were implemented. They are now apparently being circumvented. A second relevant comparison is the 2006 Second Lebanon War, during which the disconnect between the political direction provided by Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and the operational planning executed by Chief of Staff Dan Halutz produced a campaign that achieved none of its stated political objectives, while inflicting significant costs on both sides. The post-war Winograd Commission found explicitly that political-military coordination failures were a primary cause of the campaign's strategic failure. Israel has studied that report. Its lessons are being demonstrated in reverse right now. What does this meeting reveal about the actual state of the Israeli-Gaza conflict at the strategic level? It reveals first that the military and intelligence establishment has concluded that the current political management of the war is generating outcomes they consider strategically unacceptable. This is not a new conclusion. Senior IDF figures have been communicating versions of this assessment through back channels and selective media access for several months. But the decision to hold a formal meeting without the Prime Minister represents an escalation from signaling to institutional action. It reveals, second, that the question of what comes after active operations in Gaza has become urgent in a way that cannot be deferred through political paralysis. The military needs a political decision about post-conflict governance arrangements in Gaza. Without that decision, operational planning for the transition phase is impossible. The War Cabinet meeting may have been, at its core, an attempt by the security establishment to force that decision, or to make one in the absence of political leadership capable of making it. It reveals, third, that Netanyahu's political position, which has been weakened by the October 7th failures, the ongoing hostage crisis, the international legal proceedings at the ICJ and ICC, and the domestic protest movement, has now reached a point where the security establishment is no longer treating his authorization as a necessary precondition for all decisions. That is a significant threshold to cross in any democracy. Looking forward, three broad scenarios deserve analytical attention. The first scenario, call it managed recalibration, involves the security establishment successfully pressuring Netanyahu toward a series of strategic decisions. A phased ceasefire agreement, a framework for Gaza's post-conflict governance involving Arab states, and a drawdown of IDF forces from specific areas of Gaza within a defined timeline. In this scenario, the meeting functions as the catalyst for a political decision that was blocked, and Israeli governance emerges from the episode with its institutions intact, if bruised. The second scenario is, call it continued paralysis, involves Netanyahu successfully reasserting political control over the security establishment. the meeting's participants facing formal consequences, and the underlying strategic questions remaining unresolved. This scenario extends the conflict, increases economic and diplomatic costs, and likely generates a more severe version of the same institutional confrontation in 3 to 6 months. The pressure does not dissipate, it accumulates. But the third scenario, and this is the one that analysts are watching most carefully, involves the political crisis triggering early elections in Israel before the strategic questions in Gaza are resolved. Israel's coalition government has been held together by a combination of wartime unity pressure and Netanyahu's political survival calculus. If the security establishment's signal convinces enough coalition members that the current arrangement is strategically untenable, the coalition collapses. An election campaign in the middle of an active military operation in Gaza, with hostages still held, with ongoing ceasefire negotiations, and with the northern border remaining unsettled, would create a level of strategic uncertainty that none of Israel's partners and none of its adversaries can fully model. That uncertainty is, in itself, a strategic risk. Adversaries make miscalculations when they cannot read the decision-making structure of the entity they are facing. A country whose political military decision chain is visibly contested is a country that becomes harder to deter and harder to negotiate with simultaneously. Step back from the immediate noise and consider what this moment actually represents. 18 months into the most consequential military operation in Israeli history, since 1973, the security establishment has taken the extraordinary step of convening without the Prime Minister. Not because of a scheduling conflict, not because of an emergency that required action in under a minute, but because apparently the accumulated weight of strategic decisions that have not been made, decisions about Gaza's future, about the hostages, about the Northern Front, about Israel's international standing, has reached a point where the people responsible for implementing those decisions decided they could no longer wait. That is not a sign of a system that is working, but it is also not by itself a sign of a system that is collapsing. It is a sign of a system under maximum stress, testing its own limits, searching for a way through a crisis that its political leadership has not provided a path for. The coming weeks will be determinative. Either Israeli political structures produce the decisions that the security establishment is demanding, or the confrontation between these two layers of Israeli governance becomes the story. Not Gaza, not the hostages, not the ceasefire, but the question of who actually governs Israel during the most consequential chapter of its recent history. That question does not have a clean answer yet, but the fact that it is now being asked openly in the corridors of the Kiryat and in the early morning editions of every major Israeli newspaper tells you that the answer will arrive whether it is invited or not. If you want to continue following this analysis as new information becomes available, as the political fallout develops, as the ceasefire negotiations either resume or collapse, and as the internal Israeli investigation into this meeting produces findings, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next development in this story is unlikely to wait for a convenient moment. It rarely does.